Thanks. So first and foremost, I want to say that I'm a musician, and I make music as DAT with my friend Joseph Thibodeau, who's here with us today. I first got into hip hop back in the 90s, growing up in New York, listening to Funkmaster Flex on Friday nights on Hot 97. A few years later, I got into jungle and drum and bass. And I recognized certain similarities within the two kinds of music, but I didn't really know what those similarities were at the time. It was really only later that I recognized that these things that I was recognizing were breakbeats. And they are the subject of what I research now at the DMT lab at BCU, that's Birmingham City University. So in this talk, I'm basically going to go through some breakbeat history and then talk about how breakbeats got into the United Kingdom's genres of electronic music, and then talk a bit about the breakbeat research that we do at our lab and then also labs around the world. So as a brief definition, breakbeats are samples of percussion solos from funk or jazz recordings, typically from vinyl records from the 1960s to the 1980s. Of course, it's not reduced down to just that. But they're used in loads of genres and subgenres, all the way from things like hip-hop and hip house and breakbeat hardcore, all the way up to modern-day genres like vaporwave even. So they're originally recorded from vinyl records, and they're segmented and manipulated on samplers, and then they're rearranged through the use of sequencers. They generally have a 4/4 time signature. They have heavy syncopation in the individual parts, but taken together, all these parts reinforce the overall 4/4 meter. Of the breakbeats that are used within the UK genres anyway, probably the most well-known is, of course, the Amen breakbeat. And that comes from a Funk 45 by the Winstons, and it sounds like this. I would be shocked if you guys did not know that. I mean, by show of hands, has anyone heard that one before? Okay, cool. All right, good. We can go on. All right, so hip-hop musicians such as NWA were the first to appropriate breakbeats. Here, the Amen is used by slowing down a two-measure phrase, and also has a hi-hat that's been added on top of it. Alternatively, jungle producers sped up, segmented, and resequenced the Amen. This is Terrorist by Renegade. So not only popular breakbeats like the Amen are used in this kind of tradition, also breaks like Marvelous by the Jungle Band are used. Right, and so here are the icons who are Blame and Justice, who are jungle and drum and bass producers from the UK. They've used the Marvelous breakbeat in their Third Eye Visions on Modern Urban Jazz. So hopefully you can hear how the original breakbeat maybe was morphed into the percussion backbone of that track. So typical instruments that generally get used in breakbeats are those of the standard drum kit. So you have a bass drum, snare drum, hi-hats, cymbals, and floor toms. But breakbeats can also include things like bongos, tambourines, vocal shouts. Here, Michael Viner's incredible bongo band uses, of course, bongos in Apache. So as for the reasons as to why producers use breakbeats, my good friend Jason Zero offered his opinion on this subject in an interview I conducted with him. He said, someone hit those drums in a room, the sound hit a mic, it bounced off a room, and that hit the mic. That mic hit a preamp, the preamp hit a tape, that hit a compressor and an EQ, that hit a needle, which then carved acetate to be stamped into records. And so he concludes by saying that's a lot of energy to have happen before someone like me can start tearing those things apart, right? So basically what he's saying is he's looking for a high energy sample as a way to go from that into his own productions. And it's really important that he has that raw, hard energy before he gets involved in moving it to the next step. So just to drive the point home, on the bottom here you have a breakbeat that's split up into measures and also split up into individual hits. And then some of those hits, the ones that are white on the bottom, get reused in creating that percussion arrangement that someone would use in their track. There's a relationship that every artist ends up having, and they implicitly understand this, that there's a reverence for breakbeats in the sense that they have a cultural lineage associated with them, and there's a desire to redefine them as well. So the original artist wants to put their own stamp onto it as well. Right? So that could be a very good thing, and it is a very good thing. However, it does have a collective effect on the historical trace of the original piece and the musicians that recorded it. Right? So take, for example, Amen Brother, the track Amen Brother. Originally, that was recorded in 1969 by the Winstons. And because so many people use it and heads just use it, they say, oh, you know, Amen break, or the Amen, right? All of a sudden, you might get into a position where years down the line, we're looking at Apple Loops 63 or whatever it was, and out of thousands, and we no longer call it the Amen, right? And we lose sight of the people who actually created it. That's a very important thing to remember in how you use breakbeats. They have their origin in New Orleans street processional drumming, also called street beats. They were first appropriated for the drum kit in the 1950s, and this is often attributed to Earl Palmer, who was the drummer for Professor Longhair. And this is Professor Longhair's Tipitina. This was recorded in 1953. So a few years later, James Brown's drummers, Clayton Philo and Clyde Stubblefield, played drum arrangements that were characterized by 16th note grooves with very little swing within 2 to 4 bar patterns. They created anticipation through the use of syncopation, cross rhythms between the instruments, and also repetition. Big tunes at this time were Cold Sweat, Soul Pride, and then Funky Drummer.
1, 2, 3, 4, get it! Ain't it funky? Ain't it funky? Ain't it funky? Ain't it funky? 1, 2, 3, 4.
So breakbeats were originally appropriated by DJs in New York, such as Kool Herc, who found that dancers were jiving with the breaks sections of funk tunes much more than the other parts of the sections that he was playing. So he would extend those sections indefinitely using two turntables and a mixer. Grandmaster Flash then incorporated beat matching to improve the seamless transitions between the breaks that he would play. Musicians later recorded pause tapes with breakbeats. These were made by repeatedly queuing up breakbeats on vinyl records and then using the pause and record functionality on tape decks. Later than that, producers would use samplers like the SP12 and then followed by the SP1200, then the MPC series samplers to cut up breakbeats or chop breakbeats and align them with 808 samples for effect. So moving into the UK. Hardcore, jungle, and drum and bass. These are UK-based genres that are based in an international continuum of electronic music. They came to being through the intersection of the UK's own interests in rave and rare groove. This was coupled with an influx of electro, hip-hop, Detroit techno, and other genres. And more recent genres after that can be seen as part of that continuum as well, in the sense that the musical timbres and the rhythms associated with them are related to hardcore, jungle, and drum and bass. This music was made in home studios mostly, right? Like this one. This one is the home studio of Andrew Wright, who went under the name of Mercy. And here you have a Commodore Amiga that would be used for the sequencing. You have an Ensoniq EPS 16 Plus, that would be the sampler that he was using, synthesis and mixer modules, and also records that would be used as sources of samples. The earliest samplers that were used by hardcore musicians were models like that Akai S612 on top there. Early samplers had limited memory and limited functionality, which restricted the amount of manipulation you could make with breakbeats. The S612 there from 1985 had about 4 kilohertz sample rate up to 32 kilohertz sample rate. But if you use that 32 kilohertz sample rate, you'd end up with only 1 second of sample time, right? So that's very, very, very little in comparison to the unlimited way that we deal with things today, right? So if you're going to use the funky drummer, right, you'd only be able to get this much of it in. Right. So a lot of really good tunes were made with that little bit of sample time, right? A lot of really, really good tunes were made by chopping up that into a kick drum, some hats, and a snare. Now, with limited technology comes amazing technique. Some of these guys who were working at this era, during this era, thought, hey, I know how to get more of that breakbeat into that sampler. So what they would do is they would speed up the record upon going into the sampler itself. So they'd be playing it at a faster rate, like this. Right? And then they would change the root note that they would actually play the tune at, and so you end up with something like this. Right? Now, if that's not ingenious enough, the foresight to see that you could have that crusty sound actually make the tune better is also really cool, right? So in many ways, that technique shaped the sound of the genre at that early time, right? A few years later, you had things like the Akai S950. That 950 had some really cool effects on it. Right? It also had a little more sampling time, too. But it had time stretching and pitch shifting capabilities on it that allowed you to kind of add a particular timbral variation to your sound. And on the upper limit of the way that this thing could adjust the sound, the funky drummer might sound like this. And then after that, shortly after that anyway, the S1000 came out, and that was the first CD quality sampler that existed that people had access to. On top of that, it came with you could buy a CD-ROM, and you could play. You could use that for extracting breakbeats off of CD-ROMs that you could purchase. So all of a sudden, you had a whole new range of sample sources that you could use at your disposal. After that, then modulation became really the thing. So Roland's S760 and the EMU series samplers, the E series samplers came out, and those allowed producers a range of modulation capabilities to add nuance control to their sounds. So you could kind of have the release of a trigger something else based on using modulation. So when recording breaks into samplers, one of the techniques that people used was to record the entire break onto one key. Then they would take that same sample and put that on the next key, and then chop off the first hit. Then they would take that, then copy that to the next key, and chop off that next hit. And they keep doing that all the way down until there's only one hit left. This allowed people to have access to any position within the break, and you could move between any position within the break. The problem with it, though, is that people were locked into specific tempos. So you'd have to record in the break at a specific tempo and then adjust it from there. Another technique that people used was to sample individual hits to different keys. Right? This still allows you to have access to any position within the break, and you can resequence quite easily. But the problem with it is that if you'd have to be quite savvy with knowing the rhythm of the original break to play that break back within a particular time and flow. So that was a kind of a problem. And then Propellerheads came out with this ingenious program in 1994, which is called Recycle. Recycle basically would give you a semi-automatic slicing, and then the cool thing about it is that it would give you a MIDI file to preserve the rhythm. And that means that you would load the slices into a sampler, and then you'd load the MIDI file into a sequencer, and then you could make modifications to the MIDI file to make your own percussion arrangement. So, what does it all sound like, right? When breakbeats were first introduced into hardcore, several house and techno producers used whole measures of breakbeats in their tunes, often to increase the intensity of their tunes. So this is Mannix with Oblivion on Reinforced from 1991. And around 1992, hardcore began to split into two genres. A lighter, more playful sound with high-pitched vocals and rave-style pianos was continued into happy hardcore. A darker, more ominous sound was embodied by jungle. Breakbeats were typically segmented and rearranged to a much greater extent in jungle. And a common technique that was used was retriggering, which would be the repeated playing of segments of the breakbeat as opposed to whole measures. Breakbeats were played at a faster tempo in the samplers, which had the effect of shifting them upwards in the spectrum. This left a large amount of space for long, low-frequency bass tones. This is exemplified in Origin Unknown's Valley of the Shadows.
Felt that I was in this long, dark tunnel. Felt that I was in this long, dark tunnel.
And so these edits became intricately associated with the genres, and you can really hear tons of edits, which would be quite wild for 1993 anyways, in DJ Hype's The Trooper. You can also take note of the additional layering and doubling of breaks that was associated with different pitches. So pitching and time-based effects were also used heavily. D. Cruz's jungle tracks were a continuation of his hardcore output. In Lonely, check out how he makes certain drum hits change pitch during the held note with a glide effect. This kind of plays with a listener's sense of time.
I can never be lonely.
Okay, so known for his Renegade Snares anthem, Omni Trio also made a B-side called London Step, which was regarded as off the path for the era. What was so unique about this at the time was that he used these filtered amens that came in bursts, right? And this hinted at a two-step arrangement that was going to become the norm in the following years, after the influx of Alex Reese and others. So in a similar sense, there's Dillinger, who was known for his heavier breakbeat edits and manipulations before this era. He produced the Basic Principles remix for Alex Reese. And it contains a lot of stuttered and chopped up breaks, but the way that they're constructed and the way that Dillinger's tracks changed after this point demonstrate a major and deliberate shift in drum and bass towards this two-step rhythm pattern. In this context, you can hear it with breakbeats as opposed to Alex Reese's drum machines. So continuing the trend to move away from the more complex rhythms of jungle, atmospheric came about, and that was originally termed intelligent or ambient. And it was often a less aggressive and jazz or funk-infused form of drum and bass. While breaks were still used, they were often used with less attention to heavy edits. So this is Links by Chameleon, and it appeared on the Logical Progression compilation. So this isn't to say that there was a full movement away from technicality and innovation. For example, you have Tango's Understanding that has a lot of pitching and retriggering of breaks, and it achieves an incredible rising and falling effect. If you check the layered hats too, it adds nuance intensity to the break upon repeated phrases.
Understand, stand, 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 stand,
Sick. That was sick. Okay, so in the mid-90s, producers like Dillinger and Dom and Roland became synonymous with elaborate breakbeat edits and manipulations, and they incorporated multiple layers and break switching to keep the intensities of their tunes peaking constantly. So you have Dynamics by Dom and Roland. skipping forward to a modern day context, there's certainly been a revivalist tradition in the last few years. Producers are generally using breaks in a more traditional format, and a good example of this would be Head High's Hex Factor.
All right now.
So this revivalist tradition isn't just limited to techno. Paul Wolford's Special Request alias is also devoted to the hardcore and early jungle aesthetic. Also, breakbeat enthusiasts like Fracture are still pushing boundaries with incorporating breaks into their new tunes. And here it's subtle, but it's definitely there, and it definitely moves. So current breakbeat research aims to understand breakbeats as a transmission medium and also to improve the flexibility of the samples. One of the main goals is to identify the trace of a breakbeat from its original conception through different artists' usages in their tunes. So perhaps you want to see how the usages change from iteration to iteration. Maybe you want to see how certain rhythms were adopted. Or maybe you want to see who used certain breakbeats first in particular genres. Or you want to see which breakbeats are most popular within particular genres. So for example, we might want to have a look at Baby Kane's Hello Darkness from 1994, right? So if we did automated analysis on that, we'd find that he used the assembly line breakbeat by the Commodores from 20 years previous. So if you were to analyze Hello Darkness and then a whole data set full of tracks and found the ones that used the assembly line, you could see how the rhythms were used within all those tunes, and then you could compare them and find out who used which ones first, which samples were used, how they were pitched down or adjusted. And this is very similar to the kind of information you can gather from the popular site Who Sampled, where it uses user data to define who used particular samples and make connections like that. This is in many ways automating this type of stuff in research capacity. So the developed algorithms rely on automated detection of events in musical time. So with an audio waveform, you can extract onsets, or places where notes occur, beats, which is where you'd snap when you listen to a piece of music, and downbeats, finding the musical one, or the first beat in every measure. In addition to this, we also try to find where drums occur within the musical time. So we'll use onsets and then figure out what drums are occurring at those positions. We then use this information in automatically determining which breakbeat is being used and likely breakbeat arrangements that are inherent within a track that we're analyzing. And so to improve the accuracy of the system, one of the subtasks that we're working on at the DMT lab at BCU is drum transcription. So one of the PhD students there, Carl Southall, and Brian Stables and myself worked on this system that uses neural networks to try to extract where hi-hats, snare drums, and kick drums occur within a musical signal. And it takes that information and then produces a score-style representation out of that. Another area of research that's around breakbeats is essentially the demixing of individual components within a mix. So in this sense, we're talking about the individual streams, beating kick drum, snare drum, hi-hat, crash cymbal, what have you. This is called source separation, right? And Kristen Dittmar from Fraunhofer developed a method that uses a musical score to help aid the separability of drums within breakbeats, which basically solves the problem of overlapping tails. So if you have a crash cymbal that rides over several different other hits, you might not be able to resequence that in a certain way because that crash cymbal is going over those hits, right? This gets around that. So for example, if you have the Amen, say you don't want that ride cymbal on top, right? You could basically effectively move it. Or say you didn't want the kick and you just wanted the snare and the ride. Or you just want the snare. Okay, so you have quite a few more resequencing options when you're able to separate all the streams, and then you can adjust them as you choose, as opposed to having to deal with things that are on top of each other. So as for future breakbeats, there's a lot we can learn about how they've been used that at present is just very much assumed knowledge. A large-scale data analysis would help confirm a lot of this information. So source separation is also very important to keep working on for more flexible usage. We're also looking into automated rhythm and timbral information for effects processing, timbre transformations for effects processing. The source separation would also allow for more possibilities in remixing the audio, possibly in a 3D audio or spatialization context. In a performative or producing context, probabilistic slicing of drums is also something that would be really interesting to focus on yet again in the future. Nick Collins' excellent BB Cut software is a good jumping off position for this, and Max for Live is a great environment to be working on this kind of thing in. And finally, a holy grail kind of task that I would like to see happen would be an effects chain deconstruction, where you could estimate the different effects that producers have applied to breakbeats. So if you have an original breakbeat and then you have a final tune that uses that breakbeat, what effects were applied to make that happen? What parameters of those effects were applied to make that happen? It's a long way off, but it's so was source separation at one point. So I'll stop there and say thanks for listening.